Look, you have to look at the entire history of Kashmir to a degree in totality before it became part of India, the modern nation state of India. Remember, culturally, civilizationally, that part was always part of the larger Indic civilizational mindset or civilizational memory, if I may call it that, because Kashmir, remember, is the birthplace of Shaivism, right? And not just that, it has a huge history of Hindu civilization followed by Islamic civilization, Buddhist civilization, right? It is the home of absolutely major philosophers in the Indic imagination like Abhinav Gupta, right? It is also a confluence of many sort of different strands of religious belief. You only have to look at, for instance, the interaction between Lal Ded, the great poetess of Kashmir. She comes from a Shaivite tradition, so to speak, right? And with Nand Rishi, right, who comes from a Islamic tradition, so to speak. But the interaction that they had and the inspiration that Nand Rishi took from, in a sense, Lal Ded, and the interaction of all these sort of civilizational structures that came together, the religious structures that came together in Kashmir to create this idea, which we're probably going to discuss later, called Kashmiriyat, right? Now, any idea, a geographical idea of a space, when it takes the shape of a philosophy, it doesn't happen in a day. It takes time. It's like a river. It's like water on a stone, right? It keeps moving and moving and moving and polishing the stone further and further until you get something of value. So all these interactions have been happening in Kashmir for a very, very long time, much before the Kashmir that we see today. Now, before independence, Kashmir used to be a princely state led or ruled by the Dogra Rajput kings, the last of whom was Raja Hari Singh, who signed that infamous instrument of accession to the Indian state, to India, right, rather than Pakistan. Now, till that point, when Raja Hari Singh signed that instrument of accession, we have to understand that there was a kingdom called the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, right, which, interestingly, and people forget this, had good ties with the British. In 1857, the Kashmiri king refused to participate in the revolt, in the mutiny, the first war of independence, and actually provided, to a degree, a safe haven, right, to the English, and in some cases even sent some troops to assist them, right, and helped and provided refuge to their families. Now, at the time of independence, when the entire question arose that whether Kashmir is going to be part of India or Pakistan, we have to also understand that essentially there would never have been a question of Raja Hari Singh signing an instrument of accession had it not been for the invasion by Pakistani quote-unquote irregulars flowing into Kashmir. It is because of that aggression shown by Pakistani irregulars that this entire instrument of accession happened in the first place, because the Raja got frightened, turned to Mountbatten, who said, well, you know, you should sign up with India, and he went ahead and signed this instrument of accession. Now, the question arises, why did the Pakistani irregulars invade Kashmir in the first place? And it's a question that we don't ask, powerfully enough. Once again, interestingly, it was quote-unquote to defend Muslim interests, right? Now, the point, today we talk about infiltrators from Pakistan coming into Kashmir, and we forget that the first real skirmish in Kashmir happened exactly because of the same thing. Pakistani quote-unquote irregulars or infiltrators coming in or flowing into Kashmir, right, quote-unquote to defend Muslim interests, right? And that actually is irretrievably connected to what is happening today too. I am not suggesting for a moment that there isn't widespread resentment in Kashmir against the presence of the Indian military on the streets of Kashmir. But please understand, any geographical area which is under, in a sense, or which has the presence of a military in that area for a very long time will develop deep-seated resentment against the presence of military. If it happened in the city that you and I live in, Delhi, for a year, we would feel that resentment too. But we have to take this in historical perspective. Remember Sheikh Abdullah and Jawaharlal Nehru, right? Sheikh Abdullah, the Lion of Kashmir. In fact, remember Sheikh Abdullah was one of the people who essentially fought for, in a sense, Kashmir's liberation from even princely rule of the Dogra Rajputs and for a right to determine its own destiny. And a good friend of Jawaharlal Nehru, Sheikh Abdullah was. But when Sheikh Abdullah's government was removed and he was jailed, and let it not be forgotten, by Nehru, right? From that point onwards, Kashmiri politics took a very bitter turn. And before I continue on that, let me add one more thing. I keep hearing from people and again about how this plebiscite, right, that was supposed to happen under the aegis of the United Nations has never happened in Kashmir. Most people who talk about this UN resolution on Kashmir have never actually read the document of the UN resolution on Kashmir. As it so transpires, I have. And the UN resolution on Kashmir is very clear that any plebiscite or self-determination vote, so to speak, that happens must happen once the whole of Kashmir is cleared of Pakistani infiltration and occupation. Clearly, that means that we have to go back to a situation where all the Kashmiri Pandits who have been thrown out of the valley, in the only case of, let's not forget this, and I think in India we don't talk about this enough, the only case of ethnic cleansing ever in modern Indian history is the elimination, the throwing out of the Kashmiri Pandits from the valley of Kashmir. You have to get all of them back, number one, right? Pakistan must remove all its troops from Pakistan occupied Kashmir. India then has to remove its troops from Indian Kashmir, right? Once we go back to that state, can we actually consider a plebiscite? That, at least in the near or mid-term, doesn't seem like it's going to happen. So this question of debating a plebiscite is really, I see no value in it, because we are talking about a mythical thing. It cannot happen. If you really go by that resolution, then before that plebiscite happens, you need to take into account the conditions in which that plebiscite ought to happen. And the real truth is, we cannot actually today really bring together a situation that allows for the plebiscite to happen. But let's go back a little bit in history. Every war that has been fought on Kashmir between India and Pakistan has been lost by Pakistan. And yet, interestingly, the country that has given up land is India, right? How is there a Pakistani occupied Kashmir? Because India, in its generosity, gave up land to bring about peace. And this idea that India must further sacrifice and give up more land unilaterally without any benefits to its nationhood is a preposterous idea. Please understand, and I cannot say this powerfully enough. Let's take a hypothetical situation. Say, for instance, the country called India gives up, quote unquote, Kashmir and its right to Kashmir, and says there is an international border between India and Kashmir is independent. What is going to happen there, right? You have to understand what is the first thing that will happen there. The first thing that will happen there is that it will become part of Pakistan, number one. Number two, exactly what happens in Pakistani occupied Kashmir will happen here, because all talk of Kashmiriyat will get out, right? It will become entirely hardline Sunni Islam, right? Remember, already there are separatists in Kashmir as recently as a few months ago who have been talking about how Ahmadis cannot be considered Muslims and should not be considered Muslims in India and indeed in Kashmir. Where does this strain of hardlinism come from? This is not Kashmiri culture. This was never Kashmiri culture. Kashmiri culture is about the coexistence, right, of the great yatras, the great Hindu yatras, right, to the great mountain shrines of the Himalayas, and along with the Hazrat Bal shrine. That is Kashmiri culture. But that Kashmiri culture is getting decimated. Asia Andrabi is not an example of Kashmiri culture or Kashmiriyat. Let us be absolutely clear about that. When we talk about, when we sitting in Delhi and Bombay talk about Kashmiriyat, Asia Andrabi is not an example of that, right? She's an example of an extremely hardline, extremely vicious form of Islamism, which does no good, which has done no good in any part of the world, and certainly will not do any good in the Valley of Kashmir. Having said that, we need to understand that the dismissal of popular governments in Kashmir, including Sheikh Abdullah's, and the machinations, so to speak, that have carried on between the Indian state and vested interests in Kashmir for such a long time, has created a culture of victimhood in Kashmir. It's a culture of victimhood that prizes above all else this idea that it is when you become a separatist or a victim, that's when you get pride in that society. And that's why I wrote that open letter to Shah Faisal. Look, like I said, I mean, when I was in Jamia Millia Islamia, when I was at the Mass Communication Research Center, I had a very dear friend who was Kashmiri, and interestingly enough, I mean, she has prayed during Ramzan in the temple in my home, right? And that is an example of Kashmir. That is an example of the confluence that we believe in. But today, if a Kashmiri separatist leader says that Ahmadis should not be considered Muslims, that is not Kashmiriyat, and that's a very ominous sign. Please remember, Kashmiriyat ended in Kashmir when the mosques began to say or tell the Kashmiri Pandit, either you leave the valley or you die. That was the death knell of Kashmiriyat, right? Having said that, let us also recognize that the presence of the Indian army, and especially in the early years of militancy, the unmarked graves, the killings, the presence of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, all of these things create a brutalized situation within a geography. If this was happening in Delhi or Bombay or wherever, people there would feel angry exactly the way the Kashmiris feel. But I have been to Kashmir many times in the last decade, and one of the things that has been astounding to me in Kashmir, at least in the last few years, was how much there was a renewed sense of hope. The economy was growing quite fast. Kashmir has one of the best run banks in the country, the Jammu and Kashmir Bank. Kashmir developed something called the JKEDI, which is the Entrepreneurship Development Council. In fact, a few months ago, the terrorist attacked JKEDI. Now, the question to ask here is, why would a terrorist attack an Entrepreneurship Development Council? And the answer to that, I think, lies in the first letter that Shah Faisal, the IAS topper from Kashmir, wrote, where he wrote that anybody doing anything good or doing well in government or becoming an IAS officer is immediately seen as suspect within certain parts of Kashmiri society and maligned as being part and parcel of the Indian state. Now, as long as this vicious tendency remains, we cannot even celebrate entrepreneurs in Kashmir. We cannot celebrate IAS toppers in Kashmir. We cannot celebrate the return of tourism in Kashmir, because there are vested interests in Kashmir that just will not allow the situation to become normal, right? Now, most Kashmiris that I have ever spoken to do not want to be part of Pakistan. They want to be part of India. Most Kashmiris that I have ever spoken to absolutely do not also want the army in their valley anymore. But remember, when we talk about the army has no choice, right? The army has been put there. If you talk to a soldier in Kashmir, the army has been put there by governments, government after government in India, to fight a battle that, it doesn't want to fight, right? Now, the question here is, why has Kashmir suddenly flared up? In between, there was a real sense of hope and peace. But what really went wrong? I think from the time that the Kashmiri Pandits were thrown out, the entire politics of Kashmir is getting more and more viciously communal. And let's be clear, as there have been more issues of communal debate in India, whether it's on eating beef, whether it's on somebody saying an abusive term, a member of parliament saying some abusive term, all of these things have an impact in that volatile place. And I have seen for the first time on Facebook and on various other platforms, Kashmiris refer to India as Kufristan. Now, Kufristan is a word that comes from the word kafir, kafir, right? The land of infidels. Kufristan, very translated in a very basic way, would mean the land of infidels. Now, this is extremely worrying, because if there are separatist leaders who are already saying that some Muslims are not good Muslims, so to speak, the Pandits have been thrown out of the valley, there are protests if there are colonies built and the Pandits rehabilitated, and Kashmir, this idea that India is Kufristan from where Kashmir needs to separate, these are extremely volatile and dangerous ideas. And I think we need to really reconsider how these issues can be solved. I think there have been some solutions, for instance, of using the Northern Ireland model or the Quebec model. And I think we need to explore some of these things to try and solve this, because this is not going to get better. It's very clear that it's only going to get worse, right? And today we hear about this pellet guns. I mean, look, pellet guns were always there, and pellet guns actually came as a solution to real guns, so to speak. So you don't kill the person and you sort of, use these pellets to keep them away. Now, we're being told that 100 people have been blinded and so on and so forth, and that's a tragedy. I am not a supporter of the use of pellet guns that blind children. But let's ask also the question, what are those children doing there anyway? If there is a mass stone pelting against the army, the armed forces on the streets of Kashmir, what on earth are children doing in the middle of it? The question is, or rather the answer is, that in many cases these children are being used as shields by separatists so that they can attack the army. Right? And what choices? And remember, the interesting thing is, it is not the Indian army that is shooting the pellets. It's the Jammu and Kashmir police. Actually, this time, most of the action has been taken by the Jammu and Kashmir police. The army has not been involved in that higher level. So, the use of pellet guns is being done by the local police. They are using it because or separatists are using children as fronts to attack these policemen, right? And it's very convenient, right? So when you put when children are sent out and use as shields, nobody takes photographs and say, oh look, here's a child that has been put in front, and the security forces are being attacked from behind this child. But when the pellet hits the child, very tragically, those photographs immediately appear on social media. So this is basically it's a propaganda battle. Right? It's a propaganda battle. I mean, it's the same thing in many. The other day I saw photographs of children holding up Pokemon pictures saying, oh, maybe when you come hunting for Pokemon, you will help refugee children. That's propaganda. That's not the point in some senses, right? The point here is that children are being used as shields. There is no business. What business does a child have in a stone pelting battle between security forces and Kashmiri rebels, right? Or even the Kashmiri civilian population. But once you take all of these things into consideration, please also let's understand that the situation in Kashmir is a situation which cannot be solved only with force. If you think, or if anybody thinks that just by pouring more and more forces on the ground in Kashmir, this situation will be solved, it's not going to be solved. We need to find a political solution to the situation. And that political situation cannot be something that goes to the detriment of India's national interest. So we're in a almost a helpless situation in Kashmir. Look, I at least felt very hopeful when the Mehbooba Mufti and her father, the government of the Muftis, so to speak, of PDP and the BJP came together to form a government in Kashmir. I thought it was a great sign, because these were two opposing forces, so to speak, coming together, having a conversation and trying to build some sort of a middle ground. I am absolutely certain that vested interests in Kashmir did not want that to happen, right? And they would have had a role to play in triggering this sort of battle. About Burhan Wani, I keep getting asked about Burhan Wani. There are 3 or 4 things you need to understand about the Burhan Wani question. Now, one of them is no nation state, if constantly provoked, especially on social media, by somebody who clearly rejects that nation state and threatens its security forces, cannot not respond. You know, the state has to respond. The state doesn't have a choice but to respond. Now that response has to be a sort of aggressive response, because what is being sent from the other side is by a terrorist. Who's threatening security forces to get out of the valley and all sorts of things, right? So if faced with that, there has to be an aggressive, no-nonsense response. Now, whether he should have been killed or not is another question. Look, what choices were available? It is clear that the armed forces say that he was killed in a shootout. He was killed in an encounter, right? Now, even if he could have been live captured, so to speak, there would have been violence in the valley. Make no mistake, even if Burhan Wani had been captured live and sent to prison, there would have been violence in the valley, right? So there's going to be violence no matter what you do in a situation like that. But you have to take out that emblem before it becomes too big, right? Before it becomes an emblem to which all sorts of nefarious activities stream themselves towards, right? Now the question is, why does a Burhan Wani become a Burhan Wani? Maybe, as he has said himself, he had a couple of bad experiences with security forces, and I've said before in this interview that whenever you put a militarized situation onto a civilian population, you will not have good results. You cannot expect to have happy results. But there is an extremely bitter and nefarious idea within Kashmir, within certain sections of Kashmir, which does not allow anybody who's doing, work within the sort of scope of the Indian state to remain happy. There is no question. That's why even something like a concert, which, if you remember, the German embassy had conducted of Zubin Mehta in Kashmir, that led to huge violence in the valley. Why? Because you try to do anything in Kashmir and there's objection, right, from this gang of people. Remember, as some of the separatist children have written, none of the separatists in Kashmir, here's the interesting thing, their children don't go out to fight. They're all either outside the valley or absolutely at the top of the elite of the valley. They send the Burhan Wanis to fight. None of the separatists ever send their family members to a fight and pick up the gun. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in the situation. So it's become a dark, hypocritical situation within the valley of Kashmir, right? Now, finally, I think we need to try and understand how we can move forward, because that's the only thing we can do. I think there needs to be a military solution. Some sort of India needs to show that you're cutting back on the sheer number of security forces that are present in Kashmir. I think that's one of the sort of, you call it a, like a white flag, you call it a negotiating tool, whatever you want to call it. I think that's something that is important to begin a political process. The other is you have to marginalize the separatists, because they are really vicious and they are playing an extremely dangerous game. Already the most hardline ideas of the ideology that is causing terror around the world today is creeping into Kashmir. Like I said, there are separatist leaders in Kashmir who are now questioning whether Ahmadis are Muslims or not, and this, that and the other. Next will be the Shias, and all sorts of really bitter ideas will come out. And if that begins, you can forget about the Kashmiris Pandits getting reinstated in the valley. You can just forget about that. And we don't want that to happen. We want the Kashmiri Pandits to go back. So I think 2 or 3 things. You have to figure out a way that the Kashmiri Pandits go back, because the Kashmiri Pandits returning to the valley is a really important thing. Second, you have to show some sort of move in which you cut back the number of forces that are there in the valley, even if you cannot immediately remove the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, right? Remember, the Armed Forces Special Power Act was removed from Tripura and nothing really has happened there by God's grace, don't make a mistake, I'm not comparing Kashmir to Tripura. I'm just saying that here's an interesting example, right? You cannot apply the results of that and copy paste that into Kashmir, but here's an interesting example to ponder over, right? Okay. And I think we need to really promote economic betterment in Kashmir. But Kashmir, actually, remember, and there's this wonderful article in 2002 which appeared in India Today, which talked about how the entire Kashmiri society has received the lion's share of central funds from the government of India, thousands and thousands and thousands of crores of rupees. And when you go to Srinagar and you see it, and you wonder, where is this money going? And you want to ask the bureaucrats and the mainstream political parties of Kashmir, if the Indian state is spending thousands and thousands of crores of rupees, where on earth is that money going? Srinagar is a mess, right? I mean, that city looks like it's stuck in 1980s or 70s, right? So where is that money going? So I think now that there is a new government in Kashmir, there needs to be real active move to build better infrastructure, things that will make Kashmir look better, feel better, clean it up, clean up the Dal Lake, put money there, cut corruption, bring new jobs. Because even today, a lot of, essentially the motivation, the nefarious motivation in Kashmir is to keep people trapped in government jobs and then accuse people who participate in government jobs of being traitors. So you never allow entrepreneurship to really boom in Kashmir, right? You keep, poking it, you keep stalling it, you keep doing all sorts of things to stop it. And so that people are dependent on the state. When they do well in the state, like Shah Faisal does and a bunch of other people, then you say you're traitors. So you're basically trapping the population into this victimhood mindset so that the negativity never goes away, right? So I think all of this needs to be changed, build in better infrastructure, show good economics, promote entrepreneurship, and perhaps most importantly, you have to provide a political solution where you take some more troops out of that valley. Because if you have this kind of troop presence in the valley forever, already a lot of the army has gone off the streets of Kashmir, but still there's a huge amount of troop presence and you need to remove that and marginalize the separatists. I mean, I think India needs to be no nonsense. If there is another Burhan Wani, we need to take care of that Burhan Wani. No questions asked, right? We have to take care of the Burhan Wani. So that's the only way we will be able to change the narrative of Kashmir, right? And really bring back Kashmirian. Look, unless the Kashmiri Pandits go back to Kashmir, there is no point talking about Kashmiriyat because there's no Kashmiriyat left. You have to have the Pandits go back to rebuild that, that conversational, that corresponding, that coexistence culture. At the moment, there is no coexistence culture. So I think those are some of the things that the Indian state can do, and especially a new generation of political leaders, thinkers, analysts, journalists should promote in Kashmir.